From the National Pharmaceutical Congress, welcome to the NPC podcast for March 3, 2021. The NPC podcast is all about discussing and considering the purpose, process and people of the pharma industry during the age of COVID. Today, we're continuing our healthcare conversation by answering questions which come from listeners like you. The NPC podcast is presented in cooperation with Imprez. Imprez best-in-class commercial solutions offer top-line and bottom-line growth with maximum sales force flexibility, speed and efficiency. Learn more about their next-generation commercial model at www.imprez.com. On today's podcast, our guest is Bettina Hamelin, the President and CEO of Ontario Genomics in Toronto. Your host again is Peter Brenders, the CEO of the New Brunswick Health Research Foundation. To lead things off today, here's Mitch Shannon of Chronicle Companies.
Thanks, Leona. Considering that the term genomics didn't even exist before 1986, it's really taken the world by storm. First, it revolutionized the world of biology, and now the effects are making their way into our world through genomic medicine. And the economic impact is just starting to take shape. Last month, the company connected to Richard Branson bought the genetics testing company 23andMe, which has genotyped 11 million people so far. The deal values 23andMe at $3.5 billion US. In Canada, the group Ontario Genomics was formed, in their words, to drive economic growth, improve quality of life, and make global leadership for Ontario. The boss at Ontario Genomics is Dr. Bettina Hamelin, who spent 12 years with Pfizer in Montreal. Here's Bettina in conversation with Peter.
Welcome to the NPC podcast. I'm Peter Brenders, your host. In our continuing look at the purpose, process, and people in pharma in Canada, this episode explores the world of research in Canada, and in particular, genomics research. We are delighted to have Dr. Bettina Hamelin, a longtime industry research expert and the President and CEO of Ontario Genomics, join me today from Toronto. Welcome to the NPC podcast, Bettina.
Hi, Peter. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Delighted you could join us. Okay, so let's start by trying to get all our listeners on the same page. So 2 questions to open up. What is genomics research? And 2, what role does Ontario Genomics play?
The biggest biological discovery of the 20th century was the discovery of a molecule that's called desoxyribose nucleic acid. Our listener probably know that molecule under its acronym DNA. And turned out that this DNA molecule is made up of 4 molecules that repeat themselves in the spiral ladder, the double helix, and it contains all of our about 25,000 genes. And it's often referred to as our instruction book, the instruction book really of all living things. People use different metaphors. It's sort of the code of life, and it really determines who you and I are. And the sum total of all our genes is the genome. And really what happened is the discovery of the DNA and the genome and the technologies that evolved allows us to examine the DNA, open up all kinds of opportunities. Now we can sequence the DNA. We can use the DNA as diagnostics. We can predict risk of disease. We can use our understanding of the genetic makeup of a person to personalize medicine. I think that's an area you know really, really well. And now we're getting very excited about the opportunity to actually edit, modify the gene so we can actually cure monogenetic diseases. But DNA is not only present in human beings, it's present in all living things. And I bring this up because that's very relevant to Ontario Genomics. You know, we got DNA in plants, in animals, in microorganisms, and that leads to really cool applications in agriculture and the environment, where, for example, we can use genetic information and tools to enhance crop or livestock yield. We can remediate mining sites. We can track invasive species in our environment, in our forests, in our waters, and we can upcycle waste into, for example, recyclable plastics. So huge scope, but it takes a lot of research to, come up with all these different options and treatments and improvements. And that's what genomic research does. It's diving into the genome of living things to better understand and to use that to make life and our environment better. And that's really where Ontario Genomics comes in. We are a not-for-profit organization in Ontario, and we get excited about bringing people together, academic researchers, industry partners, other partners, to come together to solve some of those big issues and to seek opportunities for solutions in the genome of human beings, of plants, animals, microbes, wherever we can find DNA.
Okay, so that's huge. So genomics, to your point, touches way more than just health, what we've been talking to in our pharma space. So I don't think we have enough time to cover all those applications. So let's focus a bit and talk about where the pharma industry is involved. And so maybe you can give us, and you talked about those partnerships. So maybe you can give us a couple examples where pharma could be involved in domestic genomics research.
Yeah. Lots of examples of where pharma is involved and where pharma could be involved to a much greater extent. We've certainly had great fortune of working with some of the major pharma companies that look for, opportunities to enhance their internal pipeline. An example is Roche Diagnostics, very interested, obviously, in always optimizing diagnostic tests. And we have supported their partnership with Dr. Liu, and they have been working on heart failure biomarkers. And the goal is to identify new biomarkers that then can become diagnostic tests that, are an opportunity for Roche. Another example is the Structural Genomics Consortium. This is a big public-private partnership, actually a very interesting model where about 10 pharma companies are working with researchers in Toronto in an initiative led by Al Edwards, a consortium that now has arms into many different jurisdictions. And really what the pharma industry here is interested in is this very forward-looking research of understanding the three-dimensional structure of proteins. So essentially we talk about the genome, but the genome gets translated in proteins that make up our skin or our eyes or our hair or our organs. And it's those proteins that can have defects that cause disease. And so the opportunity to understand these proteins and find new targets for treatments is really interesting. And so there's about 10 companies involved in this partnership. And I could, list a number of partnerships where pharma has become interested in an asset of a small company that came out, was, spun out of a research partnership and, has interesting molecules for the pharma industry to bring into their portfolio. Of course, what we, as an Ontario or Canadian organization hope for is that these are fruitful win-win collaborations that are of benefit for the pharma industry, but also of benefit to the Canadian research environment and the Canadian economy.
You're listening to Dr. Bettina Hamelin, President and CEO of Ontario Genomics. So when you say benefit, you're talking about how you could start to see investment back in terms of building our research ecosystem?
Absolutely. I think it's about co-investment. It's about sharing risks, but it's also about sharing the benefits. So, there is this notion a little bit among, stakeholders, particularly in government, that, sometimes, companies come in, they get our IP and they walk away with the IP. I think that there's many, many examples where that's not happening, but I think we need to always consciously think about how do we make this a win-win? And, in Canada, we want to build our industry. We have great potential, but we benefit from partnerships with big pharma, quite frankly, because there's a lot of mentorship, there's a lot of learnings, and no one company, certainly not a startup company, can engage in a whole clinical trial path. So, those partnerships are absolutely critical for Canada, but we'd like to keep some of the assets in Canada as well.
Fair enough. And what I'm hearing in this research too, this is not your typical pharma late stage clinical trials. I mean, this is earlier avenues for precision medicine, developing some, to your point, you mentioned real IP. So take me through, where do you think companies might be missing the opportunity here to partner? Where you think we got such strong research, I hear the programs that Ontario Genomics has, where should we be doing more?
So I think, what is challenging for us and for the industry is to find the right opportunity. And, I've spent many years in the pharma industry myself. The world is a big place. And what we need to do in Canada is to not be afraid to go out there and look for those partners and be very proactive about it. Position us in a way that makes us an attractive partner. Pharma industry is going obviously where the best research is happening, but they're also looking for really good people to work with, and Canadians are really good to work with. The pharma industry is also looking to leverage funding and for incentives and for good business environments, and that needs to be provided. And I think the pharma industry also needs to be open-minded to opportunities that are outside their usual environments that they would be looking for. The pharma industry is anchored in the US and in Europe, and generally graduates from European and US universities see the pharma industry as a job opportunity. Now in Canada, we don't have big pharma research. And therefore, there's sort of this issue in the pharma industry that, the graduates of these jurisdictions find jobs in this industry, and then they look back to their own alma mater to find a research partnership. And they don't look for Canada. So we need to make a really, really good effort to showcase what we have and bring pharma in, and government needs to support us because it does take incentives.
It's an interesting message on that, because it's sort of a two-way street is what you're saying. At the one is pharma needs to take a look at that there are opportunities here. Think about this one. But at the same hand, we have things to work on ourselves. We being government policy, being the ecosystem itself, needs to be a bit more attractive. You just can't magically see it happen. And I think if we reflect on what's going on in terms of vaccine production and availability in Canada, it just hasn't been at the top of anyone's list lately. And we have some challenges. So Bettina, when you think about sort of that ecosystem that we have, and where's the frustration?
What frustrates me so much, Peter, is that Canada is so strong in research. We certainly develop IP. We create companies that actually create therapeutics. And the example of QLT always comes to mind, and Visodine for macular degeneration. A molecule that was discovered in BC at UBC, that was developed in BC, that reached the market, and BC never reimbursed the drug. So this aspect of innovation, we want innovation, but we also need to reward innovation. And I think that's, something where Canada just falls short.
You're listening to the NPC podcast. So speaking of challenges, let me go on another tack. We've talked a bit about COVID in this podcast series with a lot of other guests before and the impact thereof. And I've heard how it hit the Canadian charities and their ability to fund research. But what about you guys at Ontario Genomics? What are you seeing as COVID had an adverse impact, or have there been any silver linings coming out of the pandemic with respect to genomics research?
So I would say both sides. I'd say, as an organization, obviously, we are working from home, and we have been working from home for a year. So it certainly changed the dynamic in our organization in terms of how we engage with stakeholders, because our work is based on engaging stakeholders. But, the research environment is actually a really interesting one. I would say like a silver lining that, many of us are talking about is that it has really brought people together. It has helped break down some silos. And, Ontario Genomics has been very active in creating a network in Ontario to enhance viral sequencing for Ontario. And that required bringing together Public Health Ontario, a number of sequencing platforms, clinicians, data scientists, epidemiologists. And we brought these people together who would normally work in sort of their individual environment or institutional environments. And so this crisis has brought people together because everybody wants to be part of the solution. So I think that was a really, really great benefit of the crisis, if one can talk about benefits of a crisis. But certainly In terms of research funding, I would say that the federal and the provincial government have put forward quite a bit of funding for research. And I think that's a good thing. Could that funding have been a little bit more aligned? Maybe, but certainly lots of funding available for all kinds of work in COVID, and it's managed at all kinds of different levels. So I think in terms of research, actually, again, silver lining, quite a bit of money available for research in COVID.
We've certainly seen that the solution to the pandemic is life sciences research. Everyone's relying on that. So let's let's take a look into the crystal ball. So Bettina, what does the future hold for genomics research in Canada? What are your long-term plans?
I think what the coronavirus, as you say, has brought forward is that science and genomics and data are the most important sciences going forward. So I feel incredibly privileged to be right in the midst of it, to be able to facilitate a better understanding of genomes of organisms, whether it's viruses or humans or other living things. So, there's a very interesting report that was published by McKinsey last year. It's entitled The Biorevolution. And that report really illustrates nicely that there is an opportunity or a prediction that by 2030 to 2040, about 60% of the inputs into the economy is biological. And the root of that is genomics, proteins, modification of proteins, and what can we do with microorganisms? We can put all kinds of genes in yeast and use fermentation like we use for bread making or wine making, but now we make it to make products, drugs, biotherapeutics, bioproducts, fabrics, etc., that we need. So where I see us going is obviously we continue to spark, to support, to nurture genomics research in the health sector in advanced biological approaches. But we're also thinking of what the pandemic has shown us, that there are other supply chains that are at risk and that can benefit from genomics. And, that refers to some of the other areas that are non-health, but that are incredibly important when we think about how are we going to produce food in the future? How are we using our biomass in Canada? Are we continuing to cut trees and send them to China so that they can be processed there? Or can we actually turn this biomass into useful value-added products using genomics, microbes, etc.? So I see genomics research providing solution for healthier people, but also a healthier environment to combat climate change and to deal with the pollution that we are creating around ourselves. So it's an incredibly bright future that's ahead of us, and we're right in the midst of it.
So there's the snippet for everyone, all the NPC listeners there, that the future is genomics. And Bettina's not biased at all, so we just want to put that out there. But
never
terrific.
Biased.
Little biased, maybe. That's fantastic. I really appreciated hearing these thoughts and thinking about where genomics research is going, how important it has been to our health system. You have been listening to Dr. Bettina Hamelin, President and CEO of Ontario Genomics. Thank you for listening to the NPC podcast.
Thanks to Bettina and Peter. If you want to learn more about Bettina's organization, they've got a pretty cool website at www.ontariogenomics.ca. As for us, we're here to help you decode what's happening in the life sciences every Wednesday on the NPC podcast. You might say we put the G in genome. Past episodes are available on Google Podcasts, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, and everywhere you get your podcasts. And you can subscribe at pharmacongress.info. Listeners, if you have questions for Peter or any of our upcoming guests, you can direct message us on Twitter at 2021NPC, or just send us an email to health@chronicle.org. A third option is to call and leave your message on our comment line at 647-873-6995. This winter series of the NPC podcast is presented in cooperation with Imprez, Canada's next generation commercial partner. Learn more at www.imprez.com. In Toronto, I'm Mitch Shannon of Chronicle Companies. This episode was produced by Jeremy Visser. Your announcer is Leona Fitzdroyd. The musical theme is performed by the NPC Podcast Orchestra, under the direction of Maestra Joanne Milbrook. Have a good week and stay safe. We'll talk to you again next Wednesday.